It's a Thursday edition of the Bold Republic Radio Show. My name is Glenn Woods, and because it's Thursday, that means we head on down to Wyoming Liberty Group in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where Maureen has been patiently standing by and listening to all the absurd nonsense we play while we're in an affiliate break. Sorry you have to put up with that, Maureen.
Hey, no worries. It's pretty amusing, actually.
Yeah, good. Okay. Well, at least that's one person that's amused by the whole thing. So, Maureen has a book club now, apparently. She got me involved in it. It's kind of like a cult. It was a really good book that you had me check out. And I got it on some headphones and went out there and did my morning exercise stuff while listening to it. And it was C.S. Lewis that seemed to inspire you to something. Let's tell everybody what the book was about.
Well, one of the things I often find interesting about fiction writers is a lot of times what they're doing is they're writing about one thing, but there's a real, much deeper message underneath. You've got C.S. Lewis. Now, he was the person who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, and he was on the English faculty at Oxford with Tolkien, actually, of course, who is of Lord of the Rings fame. But you have other authors that write things like 1984 or Atlas Shrugged, and there's a message there about the direction the government is taking society, and the message is not a good one. And so what we see happening in this one book that both you and I have read very recently called The Great Divorce, what happens at the beginning is this fellow, he gets on this bus, and then all of a sudden, quite unexpectedly, the bus, poof, takes off into the air. This is rather strange, he thinks, and so he goes and he sits at the back of the bus, and then suddenly this neighbor leans over to him and he says, where we're going, people can have anything they want by just wishing it. You want a house, you imagine one, and poof, you get a house. And so in this place, people have no needs. And he says, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to go back to Earth. I'm going to bring some real commodities. I'm going to build real houses, and this will create a community, and that will mean safety in numbers. And the first fellow says, well, safety from what? And the neighbor just nudges him to keep quiet. And the first fellow says, well, but if people can get a house by just imagining it, why would they want a real house? Eh? The guy says, well, they might want to keep the rain out.
Yeah.
Oh, the present ones don't, he says. Well, no, of course not. How could they? Because, of course, what we're talking about here are imaginary houses. So the first fellow says, well, why build them? And then the other guy says, well, for safety. Well, or at least the feeling of safety. It's all right now, but later on. So a few pages later in the book, this guy who got onto this strange bus asks someone else, well, just where exactly are we, he says. Well, the other guy says, we don't have a name for it here, but back on Earth, some people call it hell. So if you're living in a place where you can have whatever you want, except it's not real, it's just an illusion, and in particular what we're going to talk about later is the illusion of security, that's not a really very good place to be in. I mean, what we're going to talk about in more detail in a bit is something called government pension reform. And what we see with government promises is they often create a sense of security that might make you feel safe now. But if it's just the illusion of security later on, you could have a really, really big problem. In fact, you could be in a really bad place. Because imagine, if you're 89 years old and you're standing at your mailbox and you're waiting for a pension check and it doesn't arrive, that's not going to be a very nice place to be in.
There's also a section in that same area that you were just talking about where it talked about a sense of community, where people, in order to survive, had no choice but to communicate with each other, work with each other, and build relationships. But if you can just wish anything that you wanted, there's no sense of community and nobody was getting along. There was no need to.
That's right. One of the things that we have in an economic system, especially in a capitalist system, is the need to cooperate with others and the need to create value for other people. That's really what makes people better off. That's what creates wealth. When you can take resources, you put them together, and you make something that people actually want. But if people don't actually need to do that, and people generally tend to be quite quarrelsome, and this is the point that C.S. Lewis makes in the book, and they don't need to cooperate, hey, then they won't. And then people start to spread out more and more and more and more, and you lose all sense of community, and effectively you lose what forms the basis of an economic system, and that's the need to trade with each other.
Okay, now this to me, as you're talking about in the way that you are, Reminds me of was it just this week? Wyoming Liberty Group had in Cheyenne a special guest from the Reason Foundation, and you were speaking about pensions. And not just, you can talk about the Wyoming pension, but also pensions across the country from cities and states and how they're failing. And apparently some protesters showed up. What were they all about?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing was completely ironic. We've got a number of pension plans here. One of them in particular is called Fireman Plan A. That's a closed plan. It has about 292 retirees, and there are only about 3 current members. And they seem to have been taken in by really what I would consider to be quite despicable person who, in fact, is a former attorney general here who really should know better. And he seems to have convinced them that what pension reform will mean is less benefits for them. But what this former Attorney General does not seem to be communicating to them is that without pension reform, they might be one of those people standing at the mailbox waiting for a pension check that never arrives. And I mean, I'm not talking pie in the sky here, because we've got a couple of examples. I mean, anybody who follows the news, you'll have heard about cities such as Central Falls in Rhode Island. That city declares bankruptcy, and it just stopped sending pension checks to pensioners. The pension fund ran out of money. This pension fund, the Fireman Plan A here in Wyoming, will run out of money in 15 years. What's going to happen?
Wow, I didn't realize it was that close.
Oh, yeah, that particular plan is in serious, serious trouble. I mean, you had a very similar thing happen in a town called Pritchard, Alabama. There's a state law that says to these cities, look, you must pay pension benefits, and you know what? They didn't. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was no money. If there is no money in the fund, that means, there's no money tree. The people, the mayor and the city council can't go to the mayor's office and pick pension checks off some kind of money tree because there is not a money tree. And this has real consequences, because in Pritchard, there was a retired fire marshal who actually died while he was waiting for his pension check. I mean, these are real stories, real human stories. These are things that can really happen. So what was kind of really ironic about our pension event that we had on Monday was that, of course, this lawyer, I mean, honestly, sometimes I got to wonder, he sends me this email. He says he's coming with 50 members of this Fireman Plan A. It's their right to come to this meeting that we're having. It's a private meeting on private property. Mm-hmm. So it was just a bullying scare tactic that this guy was using, and that's something that really gets me very upset. So the first thing I did, of course, was send this email off to our legal team, because lawyers tend to be able to talk to lawyers a little bit better. And the lawyer and our lawyer, Steve Klein, who comes on the show quite often, said, no, I mean, this guy does not have the right to come to a private meeting. In fact, any legislator. You want to talk about real rights, and I mean, I've written all about phony rights versus real rights, and people just make stuff up sometimes. But the real right is of the legislator to address private groups on private property. That's a real right. It is not a real right to just demand to come into a private meeting on private property. And a former attorney general should know that. And yet, what does he do? He tries to bully us. So, in fact, what we did do, right from the very beginning, I said to him, look, you want to come to the meeting? That's fine. You can come, and one representative. We just don't have the room. I mean, you're going to be violating the fire code. Here we've got these people standing outside. There are 20 of them. They want to come in, and we said, look, we don't have the room. I mean, what about the fire code?
There are rules out there.
Yeah,
well, I was, I've been working with Wyoming Liberty Group for quite some time, and I've learned that obviously you're just a bunch of cruel people who want to rob people of every dime they have coming in their pension. Wasn't that your goal all along, Maureen? Come on, confess.
This is the crazy thing, right? What we're trying to do is ensure that the state and all the cities, and not to mention the cities and the counties and the school districts, they're actually able to fund the pension promises that they've made. But the issue here is that the Wyoming pension the defined pension plan, benefit plan, contains the same fundamental flaws as those pensions, like the city of Detroit, which is the most famous. It's the same kind of pension plan. So what happens is in this particular type of plan, which is called a defined benefit plan, you, as a pensioner, are promised a benefit that's defined by a certain formula. So no matter what has happened with the state finances, for instance, in 2008, or it was in 2011, I think it was, the state pension plan lost $1.6 billion. But you, as a pensioner, have been promised a certain pension amount. But I mean, the plan just doesn't have the money to pay it. So what happens? So what we're trying to do is say, look, what we need to do is make some fundamental reforms. We need to close these defined benefit plans to new employees so we don't continue augmenting this problem and continue making promises that are very unlikely to be able to be kept in the future. We need to put these people on a defined contribution plan, which is something that exists throughout the private sector for people who have a plan, because there are a lot of people in the private sector that don't even have a pension plan. And that's the other irony, of course, is that a lot of in fact, most legislators are small business people. They don't have a guaranteed pension plan either. Very, very few people who actually are forced to fund these what are effectively gold-plated pension plans have that kind of pension plan themselves, because this kind of plan, because of this massive risk, this massive pension debt that they create, have virtually disappeared in the private sector. The government has not followed in lockstep with the private sector on this, and what it's effectively doing is creating two tiers of retirees. The government retirees who have this massive pension promise, so they're sort of the pension royalty, and then everybody else who's forced to pay for it. But the thing is, this plan, as you can see, has got some serious problems, and so these promises are very unlikely to be kept in the future, and that's what we want to be sure it doesn't happen. We don't want to see people standing at their mailboxes waiting for a check that doesn't arrive. This is what we need to fix, and that's why we're talking about pension reform.
I'm talking with Maureen Bader from Wyoming Liberty Group. So why do you think that states like Wyoming and other cities and states across the country promise so much? I mean, government employees, even on state levels and city levels, are getting pretty good salaries compared to everybody else, and then they're promised a pension on top of that. So even if they were to only get half of the pension they were promised, they're still getting far more than most people in the private sector, aren't they?
Well, that's kind of a broad brush. It really sort of depends. Because really, one of the things that a lot of states will do is they'll go to these private companies and they'll say, look, I need you to do a salary comparison with the private sector to see where the government workers are in comparison on salaries. Wyoming has done the same thing, but the big mistake that the Wyoming government made was that all they did was compare salary for salary. They didn't compare salary and benefits for salaries and benefits. And what that has meant is there has been real pressure to increase salaries here, because government salaries in Wyoming, and coming from Canada, I can tell you very strongly that the government salaries here tend to be quite reasonable. However, the benefits are very rich, because it's not just the pension benefits. Something we haven't even talked about yet are the health care benefits, and that's something that really could actually cause just as much, if not more, problems than the pension benefits. But when you combine the salary and the benefits and then compare that to the private sector, then what you'll find is that government workers, even in Wyoming, are doing better than private sector workers. Now, that's outside of the minerals industry, because, of course, we've got a big minerals industry here, which is, in fact, the industry that's paying these rich benefits. And this is another problem, of course, is that your typical voter thinks that, oh, well, whatever, the mineral industry will pay all of these benefits. Well, what happens the day that the mineral industry decides that, well, Wyoming is not a very nice jurisdiction anymore, we're going to go to South Dakota instead? Who's going to pay for all those benefits, all these services? I mean, people are getting a free ride, and that's what they need to realize. And they can't continue to expect one industry to pay for all these benefits, because if that industry decides to leave town, we're going to have a serious problem here.
What we've promised these folks, which, of course, a lot of it was just over-promising, but I think the main concern for me is how they have promised to fund what they've promised to these folks. And most of the ways that they've promised to fund it are just unrealistic. Is that correct?
Well, yes. What's happening here in Wyoming, and this happens in other states as well, is that in a pension program, we talk about employer and employee contributions. And what's happened in Wyoming is that the employee contribution is being contributed by the employer. The employer, of course, is the taxpayer, right? So what has happened is that the employer, or the taxpayer, is making virtually all the contributions into the employee pension plan. And this is fundamentally unfair as well. And this actually started out a few years ago when the state was under a lot of pressure to raise salaries. The thing about higher salaries, of course, is that those have to be paid by today's taxpayers. And in fact, this was one of the little blurbs that you had during the break that I was listening to, where I think it was Michael Tannery saying, is it actually moral to pass this pension debt onto future generations? Well, this is exactly what has happened. Instead of having today's taxpayers pay for today's bills from today's bureaucracy, when they keep salaries low and increase benefits that they don't actually fund properly, because of course there's a big pension debt, then what that means is that this bill for bureaucrats is actually being passed on to future generations. And this is one of the key things we must fix in the new system and be part of this reform. We need to pay down, it's almost $2 billion in pension debt. We need to pay down this pension debt as soon as we can, because of course, the power of compounding, it just gets worse and worse over time. Or better and better. I mean, if you think about it, if you have money invested and you're earning 6% interest per year, that money doubles in 2 years. Well, the same thing happens in sort of a reverse way. If you owe a lot of money and you're not paying down on the principal, the interest cost on that gets worse and worse over time. So your debt gets bigger and bigger if you don't do anything. So what we're calling for is moving all new employees onto a different plan, so closing down those defined benefit plans and then starting to pay down that debt as quickly as possible so that we can pay our bills today instead of leaving these bills for future generations.
Now, wasn't there I don't know, let's call it fuzzy math, if you will, when it comes to investments and the percentage of the return?
Yeah, so what happens with these actuarial, whatever they call them, actuarial analyses, is that they make a number of assumptions that are not realistic. So what the one assumption was that the pension fund would generate an 8% return. Well, an 8% return, I mean, if anybody can generate an 8% return, I would give them all my money.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, getting 8% is really fantastic, and it's virtually, in a certain sense, very, very low risk. But what the retirement system did about a year ago is that they reduced that expected return from 8 to 7.75, which is still too high. And the other thing that they did at the same time was make more realistic demographic analysis, so to actually realize that people are actually living longer. They're not dying as soon as the actuaries were saying. What that did at that time was take the funded liability, take the funding amount from 77 to about 72%. So the system with those changes was only then 72% funded, down from about 78% funded. Now we've had some good returns in the past year or so, and so the plan, the big plan in particular, is up to 77% funded. But what that means, though, is that should that plan run out of money today, there would only be enough in there to pay 77 cents on every dollar that these retirees have been promised. I mean, imagine, you're living on $40,000 a year and you take a 25% pay cut. What would that do to your finances?
Right.
These are the kinds of things that we're talking about.
Well, we can't assume things. I got just a half minute left here. We can't assume things like the stock market's always going to be good, or like you said just before the break, that the energy companies are necessarily going to hang around, or the EPA is going to be nice to us.
That's exactly right. We got to be more realistic. We got to start looking at the experiences in other states. And then we had the Senator Dan Liljenquist here talking about what happened in Utah and his reforms there. And Utah actually made a very good example because their situation was a pretty good one before the 2008 downturn. And even though we're not in a crisis now, we do need to start looking at how we're going to reform the system, because we can't, as you say, we can't expect the stock market to stay good forever.
All right, Maureen, thanks for coming on.
Always great to be here. Talk to you later.